So let me introduce our guest for today. We have Juliette Blevins, who is Presidential Professor of Linguistics at the Graduate Center CUNY, I just learned that's pronounced, and was previously a senior scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Her main research interests are sound patterns and sound change, with a focus on phonological typology, as detailed in her widely read book, Evolutionary Phonology, from 2004, and culminating most recently in Advances in Proto-Basque Reconstruction with Evidence for the Proto-Indo-European Euskarian Hypothesis from 2018. So welcome, Professor Juliette Blevins. Would you give us an intro, a précis to the work that's discussing your 2018 book?
Yes, I think what I'd like to do is share my screen if that's
Of course,
possible.
you should be able
Um,
to. Let me make
I have some
sure.
slides here, so let's see what happens.
You are co-host now, so you should be able to do it.
Okay.
And actually, as I was checking that setting, Zoom asked me what language you were speaking, and I thought, I wonder if Basque is an option, and it is not. Oh well.
Can you see this? Let's see,
Yep.
maybe I should. You want a full screen? Let's see.
I see it well. I just see your
Let's
toolbars
see what
too.
happens if we do this. Yeah. I just want to make sure I can still see people. How's that?
That looks good. That looks like a normal presentation.
Okay. Um, so yeah, I thought what I would do today, since I have some interested people who've read my book and an audience, would be to talk about the work I've been doing over the past 10 plus years and to sort of present my own critical review of my own work. Just start out by giving you a little bit of background about Euskara, which is the Basque language. You probably know it's spoken by, most people would say, like 700,000 people. It's spoken mostly in the Basque country, in the Pyrenees and surrounding areas between modern day France and Spain. There are at least 7 major dialects that are still spoken today. A couple have disappeared in the past 50 years. And there was a historic language, Aquitanian, which is known mainly from Latin texts from about 0 to 300 Common Era. And pretty much everyone who works on Basque agrees that Aquitanian was some kind of relation to Basque. So there is more than one language to be discussed here. Most recently, the excitement in the Basque world has been centered around the hand of Iruregi. That's where this piece of metal was found in the shape of a hand. It's inscribed. The first word is something like Sorionek, which Zorionak is the word for congratulations, good luck in Basque. Talk about things not changing too much. This piece of metal is dated from first century before the Common Era, and it's legible to experts. Yeah, there are a lot of place names around the Basque country that look pretty old, judging from their form. And probably the thing that most people know about Basque, if they don't know much about linguistics, is they know that Basque or Euskadian, including Aquitanian, is considered an isolate, and meaning unrelated to any other languages in Europe or in the world. Here's a map of the what are called Euskaliak, the Basque dialects. This is just one view of what things look like. The red there is around Bilbao, that's the Biscayan dialect. And then going from west all the way to east, the sort of greenish area here, this is Suberon. I know when you were discussing my book a few months ago, you were wondering about where those H's are pronounced. It's this area in here. So the most isolated, really, up in the mountains. But that was thought to, it says here, of the 10 dialects shown, 3 of them, Aloes, Roncalis, and Salasoris, are no longer spoken. But Lapurdian, Low Navarrese, and Suberoan all have the pronounced H, and they also have aspiration of the voiceless stop series, the PTK sounds. So those two things go together. So, talking about isolates, right, you really want to have a sense of, well, you can only talk about an isolate if you know what a language family is, right? Here's a picture of Indo-European, the Indo-European family. So we say, right, that languages that descend from the same mother tongue are related. They form a language family. And usually we call the mother language the proto-language. Over 200 language families have been established by linguistic science. People who do historical linguistics do all kinds of things. They study changes in phonology, morphology, syntax. They also establish language families and the kinds of relationships there are between languages. So Indo-European is just one of these 200 families. So that's a family. Well, then what's an isolate? An isolate is a language that has no known relatives. And Basque plus Aquitanian has been classified as an isolate because there is enough evidence, there's a lot of evidence, as we'll see, to determine that it does not share inherited features with any other language or language family. And as you might know, again, talking to a general audience here, when languages are related, they show what we call regular sound correspondences in cognate words. Okay, so words that sort of sound the same, have the same meaning, we say they're cognate when they descend from the same protoform. And here's just a little table with English words, father, 5 foot, nephew. And these words all have a f sound in modern English. It doesn't matter how it's written, right? It's a f sound. And 3 of them have that sound at the beginning, and 1 has it in the middle of the word, nephew. And then you can see Vedic, Greek, Latin, and Basque here. And wherever English has that F, the correspondence, and I've highlighted this here, is that Vedic Sanskrit has a P in that position. And Greek has a P in that position. And Latin basically has a P except in this exceptional word for the number 5. And now we look at Basque, okay? These are basic words. The word for father does not have a P. It's aita, acha. The word for 5 is bost or bots. The word for foot is onya, oin. And the word for nephew is iloba. And I put a few notes here because those of you who do know Indo-European languages would immediately say, wait a second, Aita or Atta is not so bad because this has been reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European for like sort of a nursery word for daddy, something like that. And this Bosch doesn't look so bad either because if you know some Celtic, right, that's the word for, well, the protoform is bosta, and that's a word for fist or the palm of the hand, which is often cognate with words for 5. And if you know some Armenian and you see Basque, you might think, oh, wait, Armenian has like OTN. And if you know some Basque and you look at these other words for nephew, you'd say, wait, what about the word neba in Basque, which means brother? So although there are no matches here of regular sound correspondences in this word set of basic words, there are some things that look sort of suspicious, interesting, and whatever. And those are the kinds of things that many people have looked at when they've thought about the possible external relationships of the language. But most people who've tried to relate Basque to any other living language or language family have sort of failed to demonstrate to the standards of historical linguists that there is a relationship, which means that Basque would stand as an isolate. That doesn't make it so unique, actually, because in the world there are over 100 language isolates. But Basque is somebody raised their hand, so I saw that come up, but maybe you all can deal with that. Um, can you hear me? Can everyone
I,
hear me?
yeah, I think it's something people usually do accidentally.
Oh, okay.
If people have
Okay.
questions that they'll share them in chat, which we'll get to
Okay.
later. So don't worry about it.
Okay. So yeah, so as I was saying, like, there are over 100 language isolates in the world, but Basque is the only living language isolate in Europe. Okay, so here we have a map of sort of Western Europe, and here's Basque, and all the other languages are either members of Celtic, Germanic, or Romance, um, being three branches of the Indo-European language family. And here's just a world map here showing the largest, in terms of number of speakers, the largest language isolates in the world. Korean has, over 70 million speakers. Some people are trying to reconstruct a relationship between Korean and Japanese, but by no means is that certain. Basque comes in second in having number of speakers for isolates. After that, we go to Mapuche, which is in Argentina, and then Purépecha. I had a student working on this language for a while. That's spoken in central Mexico with 140,000 speakers. After that, Purushaski, some of you I'm sure have heard about that because it's a language isolate spoken in the region of Pakistan, and then Sandawe in southern Africa and Paez in Mexico. So the highest density of isolates is in South America. It's an interesting question why. The probably most interesting thing we can say about Basque as a seeming isolate in the Iberian Peninsula is that even in historic times, we know there were other languages, right? Like Iberian and others. And their affiliations, much less is known about them than about Basque. Um, Basque, we saw where it's spoken today. This map just gives you a sense of how its area has been shrinking since the 1st century BC. And this purple area here is sort of the highest density of speakers. And that's where you can hear Basque spoken today by children. So I think Jackson mentioned at the beginning that I've done some work on sound change and historical phonology. I have a book called Evolutionary Phonology. This is one of my serious areas of interest. Yeah, as we talk to each other all the time, sounds are changing. The study of sound change is very central to the primary scientific method in historical linguistics, which we call the comparative method. With this method, we can reconstruct older stages of a language and determine whether a word is inherited or borrowed, and ultimately detail relationships between languages. So there has been a great deal of work on Basque historical phonology over the past decades, which is great. And this work, combined with the extensive dictionaries and databases that now exist, allows for a reevaluation of Basque as an isolate. And this is what I tried to do. And I tried to bring some new tools, namely tools which include understanding of what are the most common kinds of sound change and where certain kinds of synchronic sound patterns come from. So this just gives you a list of some of the lexical resources that we have for Basque and also for Aquitanian. There are lots of things listed here. They've all been very useful to me. And some of these are digital searchable files. And here at the bottom, this historical etymological dictionary, you can see the date here is 2019. And I published my book in 2018. So right after I published, the linguists at the University of the Basque Country put out this volume. It's a very heavy book. I can't actually pick it up and show it to you. It's very heavy. But there are 200 sort of head words in it. It's a very strange volume. That's why it's called EHHE 200. And I'll share with all of you the exciting news, which is that I am writing a sequel to the first book, the 2018 book. And in that, I'm doing several things, but one is to actually compare my etymologies with some of the ones proposed here. That's going on right now. For those of you interested in history, this digital collection of cartulary, it gives you a searchable place name and personal name index, which goes from 759 Common Era to 1194. It's great. And then other things that you've probably heard of here if you know the Basque world. And then in the area of Basque historical phonology, I've been fortunate to have all of these great predecessors, including Michelena, who unfortunately I never had a chance to meet. By the time I was doing linguistics, he's gone to another world. But some of these other people like Gorochategi and Lacara and Walde, I have had the pleasure of talking to and working with. And Egortsegi deserves special mention because Ander actually was a PhD student of mine. And let me see if this is on the next slide. Yes. And to this, then I can add some personal notes. Here's a picture of Ander and I. This research, you were asking, like, how did I get started on this? This research on Basque started about 10 years ago, in February 2013, when Ander came to be a graduate student here at the Graduate Center in New York City with me as a co-supervisor of his dissertation on Basque historical phonology. I told Ander that I would love to do it, but I needed to know how to prepare. And he sent me a long list of books, including all those references I just showed you. And I guess expected me to read them all in a couple of months. I'm not as fast a reader as he is, but I did my best. And then we got started. And with Ander sort of working to detail the historical phonology of Basque from the Latin contact period forward in time, I started looking very closely at alternatives to the traditional views of the oldest reconstructible state of the language. So that's how this really got started. This is a picture of Ander and I in Oslo, where in 2000, I guess it was that same year, 2013, I presented the earliest version of this work at the International Conference of Historical Linguistics. And this is a picture down on this bottom left of my first visit to the Basque Country, where I now have a daughter living and speaking Basque. So that's very exciting. And this picture on the lower right is my screensaver. It is a very well organized wood pile in the middle of nowhere that brings me a lot of calm. So yeah, after under 10 years, I was able to publish this book that we're talking about today, Advances in Proto-Basque Reconstruction with Evidence for the Proto-Indo-European Euskadian Hypothesis. And the main thesis of the book is this hypothesis, namely that there are regular sound correspondences between Proto-Basque, as I reconstruct it, and Proto-Indo-European in proposed cognates, including basic vocabulary and grammatical morphemes, and that these are not accidental and not due to borrowing. These correspondences should therefore be taken as evidence of common descent. Conservative phonological and morphological features of Proto-Basque in relation to Proto-Indo-European suggest that Proto-Basque did not descend from Proto-Indo-European. Instead, they could be seen as having a relationship higher up in a family tree as sisters, daughters, distant cousins, or something like that, but descending ultimately from the same mother tongue. So that's the hypothesis. And I thought for the purposes of this presentation and self-reflection, I'm going to sort of go backwards. You know, the book is set up in a different way where I show the reconstruction of Proto-Basque and then I lead up to this. But this is sort of the game changer, right? People are really interested in knowing, you know, is Basque an isolate? No, it's not. Yes, it is. So I have of course, been very skeptical that this is the case, but I'm trying to convince myself. So the first thing I'm showing you here, and I know this is small font, not good to read, but this is sort of like a security blanket here. These are the sound correspondences, okay? This is what we need to have to look at two languages that we are claiming are ultimately related. So in this chart, which this is taken from a 2021 publication in Diachronica, Blevins and Sproat, what you see is two columns. One says PIE, Proto-Indo-European, the other says Proto-Basque. And for the Proto-Indo-European sound, like the P that we were looking at before, it says Proto-Indo-European P corresponds to Proto-Basque aspirated P. Okay, so that means that in that word, when we were looking at father or pater in Proto-Indo-European and aita in modern Basque, if there was a P, it was lost, right? Because they don't look the same. So in addition to these tables of sound correspondences, there then is a detailed historical phonology of the Basque language going from this Proto-Basque with these sounds to the what we call Common Basque, which is more or less the language that is the mother of all the modern Basque dialects. Okay. So some of the interesting things that show up here are the fact that where Proto-Indo-European has these things that are called laryngals, which some people think were back of the mouth consonants like pharyngals or uvulars or something like that, and where there are reflexes written as, for instance, like H in Hittite, Basque. If you look at the Proto-Basque column, it shows that in initial position, this thing that's called H2, and sorry, I can't even read H2 and H3, right? There's an H in the Proto-Basque, okay? And actually, in the dialects that pronounce H to this day, you can still hear that H pronounced, okay? So that would be quite remarkable since those laryngals were hypothetical until the discovery of the Hittite texts. These are vowel correspondences, along with other people. I do not reconstruct any long vowels for Proto-Basque. And this slide just gives you a little taste of what the correspondences look like when they're spelled out in the form of cognate roots, okay? So the first set I have here is Proto-Indo-European Bahel or Bahul. That was probably a schwa. And Proto-Basque Bel, and you see this H in parentheses. This has a very specific meaning in my system. It means that that H will show up when there's a following vowel, but if it's at the end of the word, it will not show up. Okay, so it's just a special symbol. However, in this kind of word where there is a voiced aspirate in Proto-Indo-European, this is significant because that H seems to be a correspondent of the breathy voicing in Proto-Indo-European. Okay, Now, there's another kind of correspondence for the breathy voice, which we see in this word. Maybe we can talk about this word more in the discussion period, because I think that the word for seed in Indic, which is something like B or BD or BD, I think it belongs here too. But anyway, this reconstruction for Proto-Basque, bihi, is small round object that occurs in groups or in masses, like beans and bees and all and seeds and so on. Okay, so that just gives you a sense of what these things look like. Some of them look like, wow, gal in Proto-Indo-European, gal galdu. This is the way you say to ask a question in modern Basque, right? Some of these look surprisingly similar, which might lead you to think, oh, they're just borrowings, right? And that's a good thing to question this, right? Maybe they are. Okay, so let's see why there's more to say. One is because in addition to basic roots, we also have some comparisons that involve things that look grammatical, okay? They're not sort of full-blown words. Here's one that you can take a look at, where in Basque we have this morpheme, which is now a very productive suffix, like geago is more, ge is much, a lot. But there are other uses of this. For instance, it can be used as an independent word, I will. And the comparison here is between this emphatic, well, reconstructed emphatic particle and something that also seems to be emphatic in Proto-Indo-European as well. I've included here some other things that are in some sense more grammatical in both Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European, I think. This is an interesting one because I am not the only person who reconstructs this form. This form actually occurs in historical documents. It is the common term for something that's lower down, below, underneath. So it occurs in a lot of place names. Let's see, do I have some medieval Basque here? Yeah, here's one. Okay, medieval Basque. So this is dated 1080. And the form here is harbehe. Okay, is the short form of hari. Aria is the word for stone. And the modern term here is alpe. It's a word for cave. But here we have behe. So this is not questioned. This is a reconstruction that many Bascologists agree on. What is interesting here? What's interesting is in trying to convince myself that there was a signal, that Proto-Basque, as I was reconstructing it, was distantly related to Proto-Indo-European, I said to myself, look, this is such a common morpheme in Basque, and it has the form of things I say are related to breathy voicing in Proto-Indo-European. There should be a behe that has this meaning. And of course, I didn't find it where I thought it might be as like a root. But then I thought, oh my gosh, there are all these roots that look like they have single consonant extensions. These are sometimes called root extensions. And so I started going through them, at least the ones that were securely reconstructed, and found pairs like dehe, which mean it's a very common verb, right? To put, set, lay. It occurs in almost every subgroup of Indo-European. And then you have deheb, which means to reduce or lower. So if you took dehe and added this morpheme that means down or below, you'd get put below, right? Or put down or lower. So I thought actually this was really cool. And I don't, I have a discussion of this in the book, but not too many people have commented on this. And obviously, the more Proto-Indo-European forms I have for comparison, the more I can explore this hypothesis. Another derivational affix that occurs, I believe, in both families and appears to be cognate is what in Basque we would reconstruct as ben. I'll talk about the phonology here in a bit, but in Proto-Indo-European, you've got both a root to think, menmon, and you also have this nominalizer. What's really interesting about the Basque nominalizations that have men is that, and I've put it here, this noun forming suffix has a strong association with concepts that are related to mind, thought, expressions, and feelings. It's not added to just anything to make a noun. So look at the kinds of nouns that occur here. Gogamen is like a thought or idea. Gogo is like intelligence and spirituality. Memory, oroipen. Things like what do I want to say? Feelings like fear. And this nabar is special, extraordinary, so something being very notable. So these are the kinds of concepts that occur with a suffix. And many people who have looked at Basque forms say, oh, well, that's just from Latin. Latin has men, Latin has mentu, it's just borrowed. But I think we can actually, if you go through these carefully, you can distinguish the borrowed things like Basque mentu, which is not included in this set. Basque mentu looks like a direct borrowing from Latin. It was noted by Michelena well before my time. But the free forms, like these verbs, as well as the old allomorphy that's showing up in the suffix form, point to an inherited pre-Latinate suffix. Okay. Now, with this suffix, once we have a suffix like this for abstract nouns, then things get really interesting. This form here, agimen, is in a different color because we could reconstruct a Basque noun, which would be a nominalization of this verb, command, plus the nominalizing suffix. Why is this of special note? Because the same form could be reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European. And there's a really interesting discussion in Claxon's 2007 textbook about this and about why we need to put a question mark here. And so the reconstruction would be on the basis of Latin, agmen, which note is different from this form. Agimen and agmen are different, but also the Sanskrit here. Now, what he says is this, that since the reflexes continued to take part in productive word formation in both Sanskrit and early Latin, we cannot be certain that the two words were not created separately in the two languages. What's striking about the comparison of Basque agimen with this questionable PIE reconstruction is the precise form meaning correspondence. Though I have to admit that some of the same qualifications raised by Claxon could be raised for Basque because the men suffix has been, it seems, productive in historical times. Okay, and then here's another one, which maybe doesn't have the same problems as the last one. This one's interesting. I was talking about this word gogo in Basque. Gogo, it's a very powerful word in the language. It's associated with spirituality, with serious, intense contemplation of the world. And it's impossible to gloss this properly. But anyway, there are many derived forms with go or gogo as the root. And one of them is Gomunda. And the point here is that if we reconstruct Gomon, then we actually can compare that to a Proto-Indo-European form. And for those of you who study Greek, here's the form here, right? It means judging, assessing, distinguishing. So there are at least two complex word forms with secure, I would say, derivational affixes in both Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European, where they're actually whole words that do not appear to be borrowed. Like this, there's nowhere where Basque could have borrowed Gomon from, but with good sound meaning correspondences looking like cognates. Okay. There are many other derivational affixes that can be compared. This is a collective prefix. This is an adverbial suffix. Again, this word in Basque, which is a modern word, agiro, argi, clear, bright, light, agiro, clearly. This parallel form has been reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European. S derivational suffix, which is a nominalizer in Basque. And let me say more about this one. The tar suffix, which is also still productive in Basque. So again, I mean, there's some questions about the allomorphs of this suffix, because sometimes it's tar and sometimes it's tiar. Here's my reconstruction. There's one form with a vowel, sometimes with o vowel, but these are just the a forms, tar, tar, tar. So if you come from Bilbao, you're called Bilbotar, okay, Bilbotar. In Aquitanian, this suffix was showing up, not surprisingly. In addition to place names and family names, the suffix also shows up with kinship terms. The meanings, at least as they're glossed in modern, we only have dictionaries dating back, or dictionary like collections dating back a couple hundred years, so not so much time. But in the descriptions, it looks like something like amatar, which is mother tar, and aitatar, father tar. These mean resembling the mother or resembling the father. And anaitar, which is brother tar, means fraternal, so it's sort of a adjectival form. But there is another word is quite striking, which looks more like the Proto-Indo-European kinship suffix, and that is this word beretar, which does not appear in the 2018 book, so this is part of new work. I've asked several people about this word, and they didn't know this word. Bere is the word for self, when you're talking about yourself. So literally, beretar is like your people, right? Self's people. And it's glossed as like a family member, a friend, countryman, colleague, supporter, and so on. So it's a nice word. In any case, you see the comparison here, right? Similar form. The sound correspondences, of course, match. And even something that looks a bit like the word for brother in Proto-Indo-European. That's what this slide is about. What about inflection, right? What about inflection? Everybody who's interested in deep genetic relationships between two language families says, you better have some matching inflectional features or I'm not interested. And I'll tell you why this is a problem for me. because the more I work on this, I'm led to believe that the ancient mother language did not have a lot of inflection. Basque, or the Euskadian languages, went in one direction, and all the inflection sort of got built up on what we might call the auxiliary. Okay, that's the most complex part of the grammar. Everything is there. The Indo-European languages went in a very different direction, right? And, by all standards of grammar, they're just, Proto-Indo-European is an interesting mess, but a mess nevertheless. So lots of things happened. And depending on who you talk to, if you talk to people who work on Anatolian languages, they might say, oh, Anatolian languages are conservative, and there was just animate, inanimate in the oldest form of reconstructible Proto-Indo-European. And other people might say, you know what? There were 3 genders and one was lost. So, some of these questions I can't answer them, but if ultimately the language one is trying to reconstruct did not have a lot of inflection, then obviously one is not going to find a lot, right? And that may be the case here. In any case, this is just a locative suffix. Of course, these suffixes are so short, it could be a coincidence, right? Even if the sound correspondences are good, it's like, how many locatives in the world's languages are like N? A lot, right? A lot of them. A dative, this is a little bit more interesting because there's an accent. And the dative plural in Basque is accented. A lot of people have worked on the accentual system. It's reconstructed with an accent. It should be reconstructed with an accent. So that's interesting because actually not the dative plural, but the dative singular in Proto-Indo-European is reconstructed as accented. So those are some inflectional morphemes. I do talk about a couple of pronouns in the 2018 book. And this is the first singular, not Basque, as you probably know, has an ergative absolutive system. So I'm calling this Proto-Basque thing first singular non-nominative, but it doesn't really matter what you call it. The point here is that M became N in final position. Proto-Basque M became N. Okay, the more examples I have of this, the stronger my hypothesis for many things will be. Do we know other languages where M goes to N word finally? Yes, it happened in Greek, right? I mean, it's not an uncommon sound change. The thing about Proto-Basque, as we'll get to in a minute, is that because most roots were CVC, if M went to N in final position, there weren't many M's left, right? There are just some in initial position. In any case, this etymology here sketches out how this would work if you start out with a form like M, and the M goes to N, then suddenly N is marking the first person, and that is the modern marker of first person singular in Basque today. This set is maybe a little bit more interesting. The second person singular familiar, you, is in the H-full dialects, he, so there's an H at the beginning. When we come to my reconstruction, you'll see that any initial H can represent 4 proto-sounds, possibly. H, aspirated T, aspirated P, or aspirated K. Okay, so there was neutralization. So that's bad, right? That means every time I see a he, I need more information to know what that sound was. So why do I think it's T? I tell you why. Well, it's based on this form here. This looks like a second person pronoun. It looks like it's a vocative of some sort. It's a word that is used still today in rural areas to say, hey, you, to, you. But it's only used talking to men and to animals, domestic animals, which I should say are very high up on the respect scale in the Basque country. Okay. So you can see there are many variants of this form with palatalization, which is expressive in Basque. And this is interesting because, again, a lot here depends on your interpretation of Anatolian. I have some Anatolian people here cited. Some people would reconstruct not the U vowel, but the E vowel in the second person nominative for Proto-Indo-European. Some person would have an U vowel. So, but there seemed to be possibly that there were two forms floating around. Okay, so now, again, this is my own review of my work. First problem. No matter how many good lexical comparisons I have, and no matter how many good bound morpheme comparisons I have, whether they're inflectional or derivational, many historical linguists will remain skeptical about a relationship between Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Basque, since words and affixes can be borrowed. While borrowing from Indo-European languages within the last several thousand years can be controlled for, and I'll show you how in a minute, skeptics of this hypothesis will point to the possibility of borrowing from some unknown Indo-European language or languages on the Iberian Peninsula, or more remotely in time, from one or more Indo-European languages that Proto-Basque speakers encountered before arriving in their historic location. So that's the problem. And the most convincing kind of evidence, now that I've published and I've had some feedback, I see the most convincing kind of evidence for deep linguistic relationships of this kind for the historical linguist at large are grammatical idiosyncrasies in cognate forms. So either inflectional paradigms that are irregular in some way, or other idiosyncratic features that are highly embedded in the grammar and therefore unlikely to be borrowed. So again, imagine that the mother of Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European, or the ultimate mother, had minimal inflection. Without inflectional paradigms, we have to resort to other kinds of grammatical idiosyncrasies. Now, there are some in Proto-Indo-European. So I'm going to look at those. That's what I mean, some of this is done in the book, but now I'm looking more closely. The one that I treated, at least in part, in the book is S mobile. And since that's going to relate to my own reconstruction, I'm going to talk about that now. But here are some other things we could look at too. We could look at thematic nouns in Proto-Indo-European that don't really have identifiable roots to see if Basque sheds light on those and shows some internal structure. We could look at athematic derivational suffixes. It is just really striking to see that there are words in Basque, and we'll see some of these, where roots, where root final N alternates with root final R. Not very many of them, but a few. And yeah, so this is interesting too. And then finally, ablaut. Ablaut in Indo-European is tied in with a verbal inflectional system, but that's okay because there are still some arbitrary ablaut forms in nouns. So if I can get matches in those and show that the Basque ablaut system seems to shed light on those, that would also be the kind of argument I think that might convince people that there's something here. So as I said, just talk quickly about, I don't want to take all the time because I know people have questions and so on, but just talk briefly here about S mobile. And I'm assuming like there was no 1 hour discussion of this. So I should talk a little about this. Like your viewers won't know that much. Is that correct?
I think it's right.
Okay, thank you. First, some background on Proto-Basque. let's see, wait, let's see where we're going. Yeah. The way I reconstruct Proto-Basque is with a single sibilant, S. And in my correspondence table, Proto-Basque S corresponds to Proto-Indo-European S. In Euskadian, the Proto-Basque S split into two sounds, an apical S and a laminal thing that's written as Z, it's pronounced as S. The laminal, I'm claiming, continues an SC onset cluster, and you'll see later that you also get the laminal in final syllable clusters, sonorant followed by S. So after that split, there's some S sounds that were palatalized with expressive palatalization. And so from you get something like sh. So like this word for slice, serra, is from serra. And under my analysis, this initial Z, which is pronounced as S, is from Proto-Basque sketch, cut or slice. Many Proto-Basque ST initial stems that I've reconstructed may actually reflect the same root, sta, cognate with Proto-Indo-European, STEH2. And this is all background to what I'm going to tell you next, that both Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European show roots where an initial S may or may not be present. It's this may or may not. This is what's referred to as S mobile forms in Indo-European linguistics. And I'm following the Proto-Indo-European practice in listing this with parentheses. So if you see a Proto-Basque form where the S is in parentheses, that means sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And actually, for this particular cognate set that I'm proposing, both Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Basque have S mobile. Okay. So, as I said, a little bit more about this in Indo-European languages. S mobile sometimes appears with the S and sometimes without. So consider the Proto-Indo-European root spek, which has a palatalized k at the end. It's continued as spa in Avestan and Latin, so Iranian and Romance, but in Vedic, the S is present in some forms and absent in others. Okay, so here you see Vedic actually has spa forms, like the word for spy, but the plain verb to see has no S. Okay, people have spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure this out, and I don't think there's any conclusion. People have their own ideas. But what's important here is noticing that this is a feature of the language and it's idiosyncratic, right? So not all what's important is not all SC clusters have S mobile. For instance, the verb stand always has sta, and it is continued as sta. Maybe you don't agree, but I think that's the case. So to repeat, this peculiar feature of Indo-European is highly idiosyncratic. If another language shows cognate stems with the same property, and those stems are reconstructible language internally, then that shared idiosyncrasy may suggest shared inheritance. Okay, so I think I already showed you this Proto-Basque reconstruction. It is based on forms that you see here, which include this word akal, which does not have the S mobile, and this word asal, which is considered an S mobile form where the ska has gone to sa. In the form for fingernail, you can see the SK cluster medially, And you can see it also in this prefixed form or compound form where the first element, ma, is a word that seems to mean something like fruit or vegetable or plant. An alternative, because we have to think about, could this just be a loan? Could all these things be loans? An alternative to this would be viewing this as a loan like skal or something from Germanic, reflexes of the word for shell or scale. But this fails to explain what? The absence of S in words that only have the kal form, the sk to s, and the fact that there's actually another form of, we would call this an internal doublet, right? That has the O vocalism, which is here, the skol forms. Okay, so again, we have kol, we have skol, and we have sol, which is the sk to s sound change. Okay, the overlap in meaning is clear with like oskal versus askal. Shell, cortex, bark of tree. There's some different uses. It can also mean nail of the finger and so on. But they look like language internal doublets. So the point was that these O forms wouldn't be borrowed because there is not an obvious source of borrowing in the neighboring language families. Another S mobile form that has a cognate in my reconstruction of Proto-Basque is Proto-Indo-European steg, as in Stegosaurus. I saw some dinosaurs behind Jackson, so let's pay a tribute here. And that's the Greek steg. But of course, in some Indo-European languages, you don't have the S. Okay, so one of these is Celtic. Celtic has, here's a Gaulish form, ategia, for hut or cottage. Basque, this morpheme tegi in Basque is extremely common and still productive as tegi, the suffix. So that's down here. This suffix, if you know the last name Otegi, that's like Ogitegi, that's a bread place where you keep bread. Tegi is a name for, it could be a place where you keep things, something where things are protected, grouped together, and so on. What's interesting here for our purposes, the historical phonology, is that sometimes you get tegi, as in the suffix. Sometimes you get stegi, as in prefixed forms. And initially, remember, st goes to s, the z. So I've put a bracket here. If you're reading my book and you see the bracket, it means these are new forms that were what we say in linguistics. We say they're like back formations. They're based on analogy. They're not old. Okay, so I've included it to show you that I'm aware of the fact there is a word tegi now that means, enclosed place shelter. However, it is reformed from egi. Here's the egi word. The egi word means the eaves of the roof, the covered exterior structure of the building. And you could say, how come that one didn't get its T back, right? T went to H. It didn't get its T back because the meaning has moved very far from this meaning, which is, right, the place where you store things or keep them together. So this is, remember the big picture here. The big picture is S mobile is an unusual feature for a language to have. Sometimes the S is there, sometimes it's not. It's idiosyncratic, and it doesn't occur with all stusbuska roots. Okay, so in this case, it's harder to find a loan source because, for instance, in Romance, Latin has the O grade toga, right? It doesn't have tegi. And Celtic has tegi, but it doesn't have stegi with the S. And these are showing all the regular sound changes that I'm suggesting for older forms of the language. Okay, so I thought this is sort of the, part of the exposition here. I thought I would present you with what I think is one of the strongest etymologies supporting this long distance relationship, now that you have some understanding of the S mobile forms. And to do that, I want you to think about, if you think about this question, right? This is a picture here of what in Basque is called samarra. It is the Basque shepherd's sheepskin coat. Sheepskin coat. And the question is, the riddle, what do these things have in common? Curds of milk, the number 10 in counting, flotsam, if you know what that is, nice old word, and the sheepskin coat. So I'm going to leave you with that for 10, 20 seconds and tell you how this is linked to what I think is one of the strongest etymologies so far, arguing for a relationship between Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European. And the answer has to do with work I've been doing for a long time on the number 10, which is amar. Now, because Michelena and Lacarra and other linguists working on Basque do not have M in their Proto-Basque inventory, they always analyze this M as being from an N plus a B, because they're forced to, because they don't have M, okay? On the other hand, I didn't want to take up all the time, so I'm not going to talk too much about M, but obviously we can talk about it in the question period. So I thought, wait, what if you say Basque has M? Let's try it and see what happens, because it does occur in ama, word for mother, amar, the word for 10, and so on. But that's not what I'm focusing on here. What I'm focusing on is, after putting this word in many different baskets, I was looking at the dictionary one day, and I was actually working on this root sas, which is, the word in Basque, sats, means filthy. Sats is like dirt, filth, grime. And I found this word, sastamar. And I thought, oh my gosh, wait a second. I've never seen a sequence, voiceless consonant, A, M, A, R, in the language before. Maybe this is somehow related to amar, right? How could it be related? And then I thought, oh my gosh, could it be that this literally means, well, you can see the gloss of sastamar, residue, remains, waste, flotsam, sweepings, dust, brushwood, remains of wood dragged along by the water. Anything that is sitting on the surface of the water. So, and then I thought, amar, tamar, samara, samara. And I went back to the dictionary. Of course, it means, most people know in Basque, it means sheepskin coat, but it means a lot of other things as well. It also means a distaff cap that you put on the top of the spindle. It means the cover of the pile of linen on the distaff. It means skull cap, a frontal, a piece of soft leather put on the forehead of the oxen to avoid the chafing of the yoke halter, the blacksmith's apron, smock, and there are others as well. It's something you put on top. It's something you put on top. So I thought, this is just really interesting. And I went back to see, could I say that amar's from tamar? And then some other things came to mind as well, like this weird word, gardama, which, I'd only seen a few times in the context of cheese making. But this is the word for what's at the top of the milk. Usually, right, the curds, they're sitting on top. And so, well, what is this gar thing? Garger? It's actually a root I've reconstructed that means liquid or drop. And then that might mean that the things that are on top. And there's another cheese-related word here as well. Another interesting thing I found in like one of the last entries for samar in the dictionary is that you can use it. Samar bat means like 10 some, like a dozen, like not 10, but something like 10. So it seems to me that there is a word, what I call word family here, that involves es mobile, right? And where the meanings seem like reconstructible, something meaning at the top, on the top, where 10 was the top of the count whenever this word occurred, or at least the top of the hand count. And so this was very exciting. And then I thought, oh my gosh. I mean, I don't know much Indo-European, and you guys know a lot more than I do, but one thing I knew is about like Vedic numerals, right? And Vedic um Dhamma, how this Dhamma thing is used. And it is a sort of it's an ordinal suffix, but it's also the superlative, right? So how interesting that, something I've reconstructed to mean at the top is a superlative, or looks like it's cognate with dhamma in Sanskrit. And I have to say that, to date, everything I've looked at, I don't think anybody reconstructs a single morpheme that puts together the so much superlative, this reconstructed form I show here that's showing up in the Latin superlative and thamma. So, that's a problem for Indo-Europeanists. But again, it looks like there's some kind of signal here that does not have to do with borrowing from Romance, borrowing from Celtic, or borrowing from Germanic, or even from some ancient language that was spoken on the Iberian Peninsula, because this is an S mobile system showing st to z and showing t to h and so on. So that's the real, that sort of convinced me that there was a signal and that I should keep working on this. And that's what I'm doing. Creating a sequel to the first book. And this repeats what I just told you. This is what I imagine we'll talk about in the discussion period, but no matter how many good comparisons I have, no matter how many idiosyncratic grammatical features I have, people will remain skeptical of the relationship between Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Basque unless there's consensus on the nature of the Proto-Basque reconstructions themselves. The comparisons are only valid if the Proto-Basque reconstructions are well supported. And three of the central phonological features that distinguish my reconstruction from others are the M, the single sibilant S, and syllable initial spustuska clusters, as well as some morphological features. So you can see already how these are intertwined with the suggestion of a relationship between these two language families. And the rest of these slides talks about how I went about reconstructing my Proto-Basque. And there's a lot of material here. So, I'll just sketch out what I did here. First, in case you wanted to ask about it, first, I talk about a lot of heuristics for identifying loans. And then I talk about the difficulties and how there's some words where people actually don't agree whether it's a loan or not. I talk about some disputed words like la mia, which is a figure in Basque mythology, and it looks like the word lamia in Greek mythology. Then I just talk about the actual reconstruction itself. Maybe now is a good time. I don't know how long we're scheduled for, but maybe now's a good time to ask for questions, or what do you think?
Sure. And thank you very much for that survey. There was a lot there that I had not seen before. I mean, I would be interested to hear what Luke and Tony would say about this, but I thought in reading through your book, the three things that stood out to me in your Proto-Basque reconstruction were the absence of initial R from roots, which looks a lot like traditional reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the way that you accounted for Proto-Indo-European voiced aspirates as relating to sequences of voice stop plus vowel plus aspirate in Proto-Basque, and then the way that you accounted for Proto-Indo-European, the velar series, the palatal, the regular velar, and then the well, back velar, round velar, whatever, except labia velar, as equivalent to Proto-Basque series of ki and ka or ko and then ku, for example. All of which I thought were really striking parallels and ways of accounting for Proto-Indo-European features with Proto-Basque features. And your discussion only added to the material there.
Just to make a note, because for people who might read the book, I do say very clearly that the absence of initial R is just too common to be taken as sort of significant. I mean, I've worked on so many languages around the world, and not having R in initial position, what it usually means is that it was sometimes sort of a flap-like articulation, and so it needed a supporting vowel. It's pretty common, and so I didn't make much of it really, but it's true that and as I tried to say here, like for things like behe, or bihi, the word for seed, I think on the Basque side that people would reconstruct the same thing because the H is still there. So those are they of course I'm relating it to a feature of Proto-Indo-European, but on the Basque side, that wasn't the thing that people got upset about. And that the positing of H distinguishes Michelena, Lacarra, Walde, myself, and other people reconstructing from Trask, who did not recognize an H in his reconstructions. So, but most other modern linguists do recognize that in their reconstruction of Basque. Yeah.
Can I just to make sure I understood that totally? So this very recent etymological dictionary that you were just talking about at the beginning, they would also recognize the existence of an H as well. Yeah.
Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. They have H initial entries. Actually, I can try to pick it up. I don't want to break my back. Here it is.
Wow.
It's in Basque. So on top of being like unable to carry it around. No, it's online. You can access it online on the website that has all the University of the Basque publications. Yeah, they have H, absolutely. And part of what I'm doing in the sequel to this book is I'm actually going to compare my reconstructions to some of theirs. And I have a few that I've you all talked about like your faves. So I included some of my faves at the end of this if anybody wants to see them. And I have another riddle too. But La Carra is a very creative etymologist. I'll just say that. So a word that has like three a CVC could be analyzed as having like 4 morphemes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got some creative etymologists in Indo-European too, and I don't know if I was sort of struck. I was interested in your discussion of some of these sort of these so that you had this bit about men and mon as derivational suffixes in Indo-European, and it just sort of it reminded me of a kind of sort of split in our field among those of us who are just sort of satisfied with the idea that, oh, these are just noun forming suffixes as far back as we can go, and those who would like to see sort of old lexicalized roots in what look like suffixes. So like a very famous, a well-known example of this, for instance, is in Indo-European, this thing called that some people call the Hofmann suffix after Karl Hofmann, and it seems to basically just mean, I mean, insofar as it seems to mean it seems to form possessive adjectives from nouns. Um, but people would want to, some people would like to trace this back to some kind of like a root noun, old root noun compounds for the root with a second member root that means something like burden, and I sort of get the it seems like the intuition here is kind of somewhat similar, right? Is that you can see in maybe in this case by looking at the vast material that there is that this could have been something that was more lexical at an earlier stage.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. A lot of people say that about Basque. I mean, the derivational suffixes, I mean, so many of them are transparent. There's either a root or, it's just like a particle or something that they are isomorphic with. So.
Well, I mean, I've always been interested in the men and mon suffixes, and at some point we should probably talk about that separately. But
Yes, absolutely.
but
So
there's
the thing about Basque is that I share the view of many other people that some of those have no, it's not so easy to scroll through all these slides, but some of them have an historic B, and some of them have a historic M. And the B became nasalized because of the syllable final nasal. So that's a regular sound change in Basque. That a nasal that B becomes M when there's a nasal at the end of the syllable. And you can see that because it only happens to initial B's. So if the B was embedded in a compound, it may show up as P or B, but not always M. So it's like, yeah, there are internal alternations that sometimes allow you to pick out the old ones that were the B, and morphemes like that actually had initial M and don't alternate. And I guess there's some doublets reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European, right? There's things like Ben for mountain and men. I mean, I don't know if you buy into all of this, but I believe that there are some doublets with B and M initially, nasal final.
well, do you mean like buh? I mean that one. I mean just because there's so few B's
Oh yeah, right.
yeah.
Anyway.
Usually, I think by your I don't know. Maybe you'd expect W's. I know that you had one of the things that I thought was attractive about. I can't remember exactly. Maybe I'm not recovering all the conditions, but I know that one of the hypotheses in the book, which seemed attractive and plausible, was the idea that a lot of the low, the poverty of B in Indo-European is due to some kind of a change that changed B's to W's, basically, which we know happens all over the place.
Yes, and so Biggie, I spent a lot of time on Biggie. Biggie, that's the word for eye in Basque. And I ended up in the book proposing a cognate with wig, where to be vigilant, to pay attention, to not with anything that has to do with eye or seeing in Indo-European. And there are certainly uses of Biggie that refer to just the face, the attention, the gaze. It's not just the physical eye. So I don't know whether that goes through, but yes, that one and the word for turn, bil with will or will. There's a lot of those, yes. And it makes sense to me. I mean, again, as a phonologist, you look at Proto-Indo-European, you say like, oh, there's one firm B in bel, which is strong. By the way, I've found like at least 3 or 4 new forms that have bel meaning strong in old Basque words. So that's sort of cool.
That is cool. Yeah.
But and that's something like I guess I should say about the etymological dictionary, the heavy one I just picked up, is that for whatever reason, and this is methodological, right? They don't look at the root as the second member of a compound. And to me, that's where all the information is. Basque is just full of root, 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 root. And that is where the history of the consonants are visible in that root initial second position. You can often uncover what the identity of the initial consonant was. So
Yeah, it seems like on your view especially, but maybe also on other ones, there's just a massive amount of neutralization in word initial position
yes.
contrasts, and then intervocalically, to some extent, these are just better preserved, right? Yeah.
Right. And then the fact that the verbs all have, well, a lot of the verbs have an is prefix, a lot of the nouns have an a or e prefix, so that helps too with the preservation.
Mhm.
You let me know if you want another riddle or if we'll take questions from the audience. Jackson?
I do another riddle, and then yeah, I'll see if the if the audience would like to submit some questions, go ahead in the chat, and we'll consider another riddle in the meantime.
Okay. So here we are. So I like the outdoors, and I just love sort of getting some insight into how ancient Basque people dealt with their environment. So here's a question related to these explorations that I'm doing. What do the following things have in common? Boat, ivy, which is growing here in this picture, owl, and rabbit. Yeah, just give you a few seconds. I think some of you will get this one. It's a little easier than the other one. Okay. So, well, the word for owl is onça. Basque has a definite article that's usually given in citation form. So if you ask somebody what the word for owl is, they'll say onça. Here, I take the determiner off. So once, this is like a dictionary entry. Ivy is onça. And the word for boat is onci or unci, and the word for rabbit is unchi. So again, I'm doing this by little formulas about, having a table with an initial consonant and then, a vowel, a nasal, an S at the end historically, and filling these things in. And I'm like, wait a second, there's something here, like, because the oo you get for free from O by raising next to nasals. There's a sort of vowel raising process. And then it struck me like, oh my gosh, every time I look at this ivy in the Basque Country, it's always like coming out of these hollows in the trees. And that's where the owls live, and the rabbits are living in their own little hollows. And, a boat and a pot and a vessel, a pot, all of these things, they're all hollowed out containers. And so I think that this word, historically, this root meant something like hollow or hollowed out or thing in a hollow, right? And I thought I was going to leave the next part to you all. I mean, of course, you can look in the book, but if you know any Proto-Indo-European, you can try to think of what root would match here, and you can use the correspondence table. So the initial aspirated K should match the plain K in Indo-European. Possibly in this position, it could be palatalized or labialized. And this O in the matching table would match either an O grade or EU as a sequence. And then N would match N and S would match S if it had this full form. So I will leave that to you, but this is This is one of the cognate sets I really love. And again, some people say, well, like what contributions has Blevins made to our understanding of Basque? These word families that I'm showing you, no one has discussed these. These are like my vision of how the Basque lexicon is constructed. And they're very different from what other people see. And so while we're on this, can I just do my other fave?
Sure.
This is my other fave. This is actually, again, it's the natural world. And this one, I don't have to tell you because I already talked about the PIE cognate, which is bel or bleh, whatever, the form that you find in like blah, a blade of grass, right? Well, this is beautiful because, well, of course, there is the word belar, which means grass, herb, leafy things, medicines, like from herbal medicine and so on. And then that stem gets used for like the medicine woman and meadows and this and that. But the root, the bare root shows up in compounds, like I was telling you, usually as the second member, but in one beautiful word as the first member. And this is the word beldara. And not many people know this word. It's been taken over by a Spanish loan, but it means caterpillar. And I think I had just like finished this etymology, and I was at a Basque immersion school in the Basque country, and she was asking us to just name animals and creatures we knew. And I was like, Bendara. And she was like, that's not a Basque word. And I said, it isn't. And I was really disappointed. And then she, we went for lunch and she came back and she's like, how did you know that word? That's a Basque word. That's a really good Basque word. And, from then on, we taught everybody this word for caterpillar. But look, literally, it's got that tar suffix. The voicing is a sound change, regular sound change. So it means the leaf dweller. I like that word, beldad. And one of these has this is why I brought this one up. Orbel was analyzed by Michelena, and Lacarra followed him as, what does the word mean? It's a word for dry leaves that have fallen from the trees, usually like, blowing around in the wind, that kind of thing on the ground. And they analyzed it as having first element or from ori or orsto, which is a word for leaf, which could well be borrowed from Latin, like osto. And then the second element is their bel, which means dark or black. And when I first saw this, I thought, why does that have to do with fallen leaves? They're not black. They're not even really that dark. I mean, maybe you would say gori, red, orange, yellow, some other color, but not black. So I was always a little suspicious of that. And then when I came up with this bel leaf thing, and found this word for seaweed, which looked even better. Like gor means red and bel means leaf. And it's the word for that red algae and seaweed that grows on the Atlantic. So that looked really good. So I thought, this must mean something else. So I reanalyzed this, and I think my etymology is better because it means dry, or is the root for dry. Leor means dry. So dry leaf. Well, that's what the word means, right? So this is the kind of comparison that you will see more of in the sequel.
Really cool. That's a great word for caterpillar. We've got several questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see them too. I'll read aloud just so that people can hear them in a video later. So Jay asks, if Proto-Indo-Europeans' various morphological suffixes are not in the shared ancestor with Proto-Basque, then I'd think they should be transparent in the shared proto-language or later stage. Am I right in assuming that? And does your Proto-Basque reconstruction help shed light on their origins? Do you see that in the chat?
I don't see it, but that's fine. I don't think that's true. Okay, so this is where typology and the study of many different languages and their rates of change and their inflectional systems is really useful. Because we can see languages evolve complex morphology pretty quickly in different places. And that, like, I think one of the interesting cases that is being investigated now is the work that Ed Vida is doing on the Yeniseian languages of Central Siberia and the Na-Dene languages of North America, and a potential distant relationship there. So I don't think it's the case that the complex inflectional system of Proto-Indo-European could not have evolved over the course of 500 to 1,000 years. I don't think that's impossible. If that, things like that happen, and we can observe them happening.
B. Avorsky also had a comment rather than a question, saying Celtic does show some S-less roots from the stand root stech, citing Old Irish atta for is. Nate had a question. How does the idea of a common...
Let me just chip in briefly in this way, just to explain my sort of, it's very robustly ST initial, but also, also Hittite T is quite hard without an S mobile. And in that case would sort of do this kind of like Indic, show a kind of within branch split, basically. It looks like maybe both were there. But I agree that is one of the ones where like it's everywhere in the family and it's quite robustly ST. It's just there are these marginal traces of things that look just T-fold. Just a minor kind of wrinkle.
Yeah,
that's
so
interesting.
I figured that it wasn't absolute, but that's okay. It's still strong. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, and this frequently asked question, I think, goes along. It's a second half of the answer to the person who asked before about inflectional systems and things. Because some people say, like, if the original language, didn't have or had minimal inflection, are you saying that like Basque is so conservative in so many ways? And, like a lot of my experience, the language family that I know the best, that's the oldest, is Proto-Austronesian, and it's reconstructed with almost no inflection. And it seems to be a very stable system because the 6,000-year-old infixes and suffixes are still productive today in many languages. And the phonology also has been very stable in some places for thousands and thousands of years. So this idea that, languages just have to change at a certain rate, I think it's not the case. We have instances of fast change, we have instances of no change, and clearly, isolation will play a role, or contact on the other hand. I mean, the more contact, the more you expect quick change. And of course, Basque has changed dramatically since the Roman invasion.
That's an impressive parallel, looking at that, the Austronesian roots there. Nate had a question in the chat. How does the idea of a common ancestor language for both Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European align with anthropology and historical migration or commerce patterns that are generally accepted?
I'm afraid that's a question for anthropologists and archaeologists and possibly geneticists too. I don't think I have the time, energy, or expertise to get into all that. I mean, at some point I thought I would and I could, but I don't. So I'm going to focus on the language and leave that to other people should this get more traction. I did put that Lamia word out there for all of you Greek fanatics. Where is it? Oh yeah, the loans, right? So I'm just telling you about how the reconstruction goes and how there are words that we just don't know that much about. And it's up here somewhere. Sorry, I have to do this here. Basque la mia is a traditional, usually a woman, lives near rivers, beautiful, long hair, webbed feet. They take care of bridges. They come out at night. They're associated with certain eating habits. And the interesting thing, so you could say, oh, it's borrowed from Greek. But how, if it's borrowed from Greek, what is the N doing there? Because the N, the N goes to 0 between two vowels. So there's a historic N there that's not in Greek. And if it came from Greek, why is it in so many place names, including, I've given you one here that's dated to 945. That's from the cartulary, Lamituri, and Ituri is a spring. And this is where these lamias hung out, right? So this is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that is. And there's actually a question down here. I'll skip ahead to, because the potential relation of that, Joseph had asked, can you speak a bit on the comparative mythology of Indo-European and Proto-Basque?
Yeah. It's really hard to tell with the Basque myths. They weave in so many sort of modern sounding characters, and Mari, who's like the female center character, some people think it's pre-Christianity, some people think post-Christianity, like why is her name Mari and all this, but there's a lot of debate about it. I mean, they're good stories, and I think a lot of people have done, Celtic Basque comparisons, and clearly, I mean, look, I had another word talking about the Celtic, this word, laia. So cultural exchange. The laia is the traditional manual Basque farm tool. The Basques did not have the plow, okay? So the laia is like this heavy, two-pronged iron foot plow that they turn the earth with. And you could say, well, the Basques borrowed it from the Celts, or the Celts borrowed it from the Basque, but I think it must be a native Basque word, because the N, again, if it is from the root to work, which it looks like it is, like work as in cultivating the earth and this kind of labor, then lai is the form derived from lani with the N loss, intervocalic N loss, which is just like, we know of this in post-Latin times, okay? But then that lan thing doesn't translate into Celtic, so that means that the Celtic word that has no evidence of the N should be a loan from Basque. So to get back to the myths, I think there was a lot of back and forth with dancing, myths, and even like headstones on graves and things like that. There are a lot of similarities.
All right. And I think as to Cameron's question about whether Proto-Basque speakers might have migrated into Europe from the steppes, it sounds like you're not commenting on that kind of archaeological historical question.
It's just a trace of it in the book. So I was looking, one of my students actually asked me to ask this question to you as well. I just think I agree that it's kind of a separate enterprise, but it would be nice to have this kind of additional support. But yeah, ultimately kind of, so I mean, with all the ongoing work in genetics, it feels like it's, yeah, the thing to do is, put someone onto this question, convince them it's something that's worth investigating. Because again, I think there was just a trace in the book, right? Something about shared DNA with, I think, Sardinia, and a possibility of that being a pathway to the Basque. Anyway.
Yeah, there are lots of things like, well, I'm going to do a sequel, so I will make it clear that I retract certain things. I mean, I felt I should comment because that's the first question everyone wants to ask. Well, how did they get there? How did this all happen? And actually, Bob Blust, who's sort of one of my linguistic heroes, he's passed away now, but he said, Juliette, like the work seems great, but it's implausible. It's impossible. He just had this view that like if you're not Austronesian sailors, you can't get from one place to another, and that's one view, is that it's just impossible. But I think that what has to happen first is the language work, because like as people have pointed out, there could have been a lot of other people around the Iberian Peninsula too that we don't really know much about.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah, you bring up Tocharian as a sort of comparandum, and of course it wouldn't be quite the same because Tocharian is understood to be a descendant of Proto-Indo-European, even if it's a language that split off pretty early. But from a geographical perspective, I haven't measured how far it is from Ukraine to Western China versus Ukraine to northern Spain on Google Earth recently, but I suspect that they're pretty comparable as far as distance traveled. So I don't see why it would be impossible for some group to migrate from somewhere in the area of the steppes. And of course, we can get into whether that's where the ancestors of the or the ancestors of the Basque would have been coming from. But there's certainly there's no barrier to that from a strict plausibility standpoint.
And no barrier to the idea that, I mean, we're talking about time depths where the ancestor of Proto-Indo-European was somewhere other than the steppes, or that there was some actually fairly large macro family spoken between Iberia and the steppes that included Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European among its descendants. I mean, there's so many possibilities there that you could speculate a lot without being able to answer, but all interesting possibilities.
Yes. I mean, I think also what I'm interested in is like the dating of the sort of Basque agrarian culture in the Iberian Peninsula. So I've been trying to at least follow that literature. There are a lot of Basque people unearthing human remains and animals, and so far it actually doesn't look like there's too much more, like 5,500 before the present. That's when you see humans and animals like buried together, and evidence of certain seeds, barley, and certain kinds of wheat. So that's an interesting thing we would like to date, right? How long people who were possibly speaking Proto-Basque or something like Basque have been on the Iberian Peninsula.
I think the really interesting question concerning what you just mentioned, which is not something you want to get into, so I'm not going to ask you. I'm just going to say this. I think the really interesting question, the three of us touched on this in our review a few months ago, is whether those early Basque speakers would have been the people who introduced agriculture to Iberia, or if they might have come a little bit later. Genetics might be able to help, but genetics is also this incredibly fast-moving field, especially these days. So, if we came up with one solution today, it might be, changed by some data that comes out next year.
That's, yeah. And that, going back to the Celtic Basque connections, I don't think anyone has managed to answer the question of the apple distribution of apples, which is important in both cultures. The biggest variety of apples in Europe, the two locations are in the British Isles and in the Basque Country, I believe. And so I've always been curious, like why no one has been looking at the evolution of apples and graphs and so on to see if they can get information there, but I haven't found anything significant. So.
And there might be something really surprising there potentially.
Yeah.
David
The
Sanford
rate has been mapped. Sorry.
Sorry.
I was just saying the grape has been mapped. I think people have a pretty good idea of when, grapes started sort of being grown in the South and then moved sort of northwards bit by bit.
Let me, there's a few more questions in the chat if you have time for them. David Sanford said, thanks for coming, Professor Blevins. I've seen some historical Vasconists who are quite critical of your work, which from what I've seen is quite different from the standard accepted reconstruction of Basque, a la Michelena, and Trask. Do you do much work with other Vasconic historical linguists, and do you intend to work on this?
The answer, I guess, is yes. I mean, one of my closest colleagues is Andrei Rutsegi, the man whose dissertation I co-supervised. I co-supervised that with La Cara, who's one of the linguists I think they're talking about. So I have tried to engage them. And unfortunately, since the publication of my book, they haven't been so interested. And, this isn't, it's not really that I'm trying to convince anybody of anything, but what I would like to do is discuss the issues, discuss why, one word like, guts, where I say like, oh, maybe an R was lost before S or something. Why is that the focus as opposed to sort of the bigger picture of what these roots and stems look like, and whether, the distributional aspects of, say, the single sibilant that I reconstruct, why anybody doing a historical analysis of the language wouldn't come up with the same thing. I mean, it is one logical possibility, and the question is, why isn't it being considered? Likewise, with the M, it's another alternative. Then you have to just evaluate the system side by side and ask which is more revealing.
Have these critics marshaled data and or logic to try to argue with, the system that you put out in the book, or have they pretty much just ignored you?
There's been some degree of ignoring. So I certainly haven't been like invited to talk at the University of the Basque Country since like 2014 or 15. But the reviews and the little comments that appear here and there are really nitpicky. I mean, like I try to teach my students like never to do this to other people. It's just not fair. We all make mistakes. And I mean, sometimes they're right. Like I really am grateful for all the comments I've had from, let's say, Hualde or Grachategi, whatever. But those are in print, not that they gave them to me personally. But I'm very, very thankful. And like I said earlier, I wish I had had those in the proof stage of the book, since I sent everybody a copy, because there would be fewer errors. I'm not a speaker of the language. I came to it late in life. I'm enthralled and I've done my best, but of course I'm going to make mistakes here and there. But, you can look at lots of cases in the literature, like, Mary Haas's hypothesis about, Algonquian being related to Yurok and Wiyot, something, I've worked on the Yurok language, and, her, like, some of her etymologies are wrong, it doesn't, the big idea was there, and she sort of felt it, sensed it, was working towards something, and, in a very different era from the one we have now, with limited information. So I think people should be kinder in our field. And at least discuss this in an open forum. So
looking forward to your sequel, which you teased a little bit, it doesn't sound like you're going to have any like really big changes to your basic theory based on any feedback that you've gotten. There might be small things that they pointed out that you can fix here or there, but it sounds like the basics that you've put forward in the book and that you're putting forward here are going to be what you're working with going forward. Is that right?
I might have more to say about M. I think there's some really interesting stuff going on with MB. something maybe even from Celtic influence. So I think there's more to the M than meets the I, like some sort of, I don't know if there was like some kind of pronunciation like mba or something, but there's something interesting to say, I think, about M. And other things, well, more focus on the kinds of characteristics that I think might convince people. And, I've already detailed most of the sound changes, and I think those are still valid. Like, yeah.
And those are really the logical heart of your work. In other words, if those stand, then it really reduces the number of avenues that people could question your basic thesis on, I think.
Yes, I think that's true. And also in the earlier work, I didn't look so closely at, I mean, for the comparative part, I didn't look so closely at the Proto-Indo-European particles because I mean, I have that volume, that LIVV volume that I've had it for years, but I just like, I didn't think about particles as being like significant. But then I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, if, if this language like had lots of particles and those are the things that grammaticize, then I need to look a lot at those. And so yeah, there might be a little more about that grammaticization of particles.
Apropos of that, there was a question from Michael. Are there new avenues of study, perhaps other sound patterns or bits of morphology that you're planning to use in the part 2 analysis, which weren't discussed in the original work?
Let me follow. Can I just build on that a little bit? I felt like you might have flagged something about RN alternations and maybe in Indo-European, therefore Indo-European RN stems.
Yeah.
I felt
Okay.
like you
I'll
might
give you a
talk
hint of
about that.
that. Yeah. I wasn't
The
sure how much
person
to
who's
put in here.
relatively interested in RN stems, I felt like I couldn't pass up the chance to ask.
Okay, here we are. Here we are. Okay, I didn't want to put the water stuff on because it's too complicated, although there are water words like ud, but I have to go through all the dialect stuff because of course, this is something I've been criticized for is how I'm using dialect material, but these are sound. This word for day, so the modern word is egun, eguna. And in certain, means combining form, CM, so like the first member of some compounds, right, which look old, right? So Iralde, there's an R here. Okay, there's no N to R sound change in the language. Okay, this is just a different final. And then actually there's also like the bear stem, which occurs in words like igualgia. Igualgia is daylight. So, and this context, I picked this word expressly because it's two vowels, so it's not the case that the N or the R deleted before another consonant, right? This would be a fine place for a consonant. So that is, as I say here, if cognate PIE, PB heteroclitic stems were discovered, this could provide firm evidence of a distinct genetic relationship between the two languages, even though, of course, for the Basque, as with the ablaut that exists there, which, by the way, no one talks about in their treatments of historical Basque linguistics. But if there were these things, I think it would be just so interesting, right? You see these different consonants showing up, but there doesn't, there's no rhyme or reason to it in the Basque, right? They're just different constructions or different word types.
Yeah. Is this the same argy? Is this the one that we actually talked about? That this is the one that so this would really be a I don't know, somehow this would be extremely attractive. And this root doesn't have Indo-European comparanda, does it? I mean, there is the Sanskrit. Doesn't quite match the Sanskrit word for day, ahar, but it's
it might, but it's complicated. But
Funny because that's on Wednesday.
Since you brought this up, so there was something else. I had a page for you. And also to yeah, you asked about would it be more or less the same? Another detail of the phonology that I think I jumped too soon on, Luke. So the laryngeals. You know, when I went back through all the material, and so one thing I'm trying to do is like just come up with these forms that these are everyone, I think, who does Basque historical linguistics would have something very close to these reconstructions. Okay. Like these are not really disputed. Okay, so that's good, right? Because these look pretty firm for the correspondence between PIE H2 and the Ha. But what I realized was the only good sets I have are H2 and H3. And as with Anatolian, those H1s, they're sometimes they're sort of there and sometimes they're not there. It's not regular. So that was interesting to me to review that and just say, you know what, I think I'm going to be super conservative. And if it's not like in the modern language, and even if I think it should be there, and even if I have an H that looks like it metastasized, I'm not going to take that. I need that H in the prevocalic position to say there is a reflex of H1 in particular. So that's another difference.
It would be unsurprising if H1 were less robust. I mean, less well preserved. I mean, everyone, most people think it's just an H. Other people think it's a glottal stop. These are kind of it's something that's very losable. So, but anyway, that's very nice to hear that kind of refinement.
And I guess I thought this was, connection to Anatolian because some of these, I mean, this is, I think, just Indic and Anatolian, right? The valley word. Basque has aran. Aran is the modern word for valley. I mean, there's an ara form and aran with the final N. Any other questions from the audience?
If anyone does have one, please put it in the chat and I'll read it aloud. So you can't see the chat?
I could try again. I think because I have maybe because yes, I do. Let's see. Now you see it too, right?
No, I just see your slide.
Oh, okay.
Too much more time, but can I ask maybe just one more small one since while we're waiting here? Do you have any further thoughts on this? I mean, one thing I thought was very cute and was interested in is this comparison between this tar suffix, the source or place at along those lines, and obviously the Proto-European agent noun suffixes. And you sort of acknowledge the semantic match is somewhat imperfect, but in many ways it looks attractive, especially if they're a prosodic match, and in the sense that they're sort of both stress attracting suffixes and so on. Have you had any further thoughts on this about like how it looked like you had some more? I mean, I asked in part because it looked like you had some more etymologies that involved it. So
yeah, so I'm sort of starting bottom up, but I did spend a lot of time. And I can't remember whether I put it in the book because I spent a lot of time looking at like the evolution of agentive morphemes and where they come from. So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and just sort of also the kinds of potential semantic shifts you get with things like kinship suffixes.
Well, I've found this discussion really interesting, and part of what I've appreciated is that you brought news and updates on what we had already read. I've really appreciated the time that you've taken with this. Do you have any concluding remarks you want to make? Tony or Luke, do you have any?
I would just echo your thanks, and I think this is fascinating, and I hope that this, I don't know, inspires interest among Indo-Europeanists, who I think should be, as I said in the last time, sort of, they should be captivated by the explanatory power of this connection, if indeed it holds. When, to my mind, it's attractive. So. So yeah, thank you again, and I really appreciate you previewing what we all will now have something exciting to look forward to.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for sharing this with so many people. And yeah, I mean, I'm just so glad I had the opportunity. As you can see, I could talk about this for hours. So if ever you do get someone from the Basque group who wants to have a public discussion, please let me know. I'm always happy to talk about this work. So thank you again.
I'd be happy to host that. I don't know. I have no idea whether someone would want to rise to that, or whether they would consider my channel a natural place to have it hosted, but I would host it. But no, I think your work is done too responsibly to be ignored. There's a lot of over the years, we've all seen macro language family proposals, and so often they're done with very insufficient attention to the data,
and to the methodology, I should point out.
And to the methodology, and that's not the case with this.
Yeah.
So I've really appreciated the chance to help you get the word out about your work, and I really appreciate, again, you coming here and talking to us yourself about it. With that being said, we've gone about 2 hours, probably taken more of your time than originally scheduled. So I think I'll adjourn this for now, and perhaps we can have another meeting another time to talk about the next stage of your work. I'm looking forward to seeing your sequel.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks so much to all of you.
Thanks again.
Thank
Bye.
you, and all the best, everybody.